She cut my padlock, didn't knock, didn't call, didn't leave a note. Just showed up at my private cabin on my private land with a pair of bolt cutters, snapped the lock clean off, and walked inside. This woman had sent me 17 violation notices for a property she had zero legal authority over. She'd filed complaints with 3 county agencies, all dismissed. She'd hired a fake environmental consulting company, run by her own son, to harass me with fraudulent reports. And after all of that, she still thought she could just walk in. What did she think she was going to find in there? A man who'd given up? Someone who'd finally break under the pressure and sign her paperwork and make it all go away? She had no idea what was actually waiting for her, and neither do you, yet. What would you do if someone cut the lock off your private property? Drop it in the comments. And where are you watching from? Let me know below. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Decker Halverson, 58 years old, retired pipe fitter. I spent 31 years crawling through industrial facilities, in the cold and the heat and the dark, threading pipe through spaces that weren't designed for human beings, so that one day I could buy a piece of land and be left alone on it. That day came after 22 years of saving, 14 acres in the Flathead Valley foothills of northwest Montana. Not a vacation property, not a weekend getaway, a homestead, a hand-built A-frame cabin, a woodshed I put up myself over one long August, and a spring-fed stock pond that sits at the south end of the property like it was placed there on purpose by someone who wanted me to have a good reason to sit still. The smell of pine resin in the morning, the crunch of frost under work boots before the sun clears the ridgeline, cold creek water running somewhere you can hear but not see. This was the place I'd promised myself for 3 decades. Now, the land sits at the edge of a planned recreational community called Ridgecrest Pines, mostly weekend lake houses owned by people from Missoula who drive up on Fridays and leave Sunday afternoon. I bought my parcel before the HOA incorporated. My property is adjacent to the development, not inside it. I never signed a single HOA document, not one. My deed is clean, my parcel map is clear, and my property taxes go to Flathead County, not to any community association. This matters. Remember it. Because approximately 8 months before she cut that padlock, I received a certified letter in my mailbox. Cheap inkjet printing, still faintly warm from the printer. The paper had that particular smell of an office machine running low on toner, slightly burnt, slightly stale. The return address said Ridgecrest Pines Community Association. Inside was a formal violation notice. It cited Ridgecrest Air Quality Covenant Section 4.2 and informed me that my wood stove was emitting particulate matter in violation of community standards, and that I had 30 days to remedy the situation or face further action. My wood stove, in my cabin, on my land, which is not in Ridgecrest. The notice was signed by the HOA board president, Vivian Pratt. Now, I want to describe Vivian Pratt to you because understanding her is important to understanding everything that followed. Vivian is a retired HR director from a regional insurance company. She is the kind of person who irons her linen sets before walking her dog. She owns a golf cart with a custom VP emblem on the hood and drives it down the private road through Ridgecrest like she's leading a motorcade. She has been HOA board president for 3 consecutive terms. Not because anyone is particularly enthusiastic about her leadership, but because nobody else wants the job badly enough to run against her. She uses the phrase community standards the way a pastor uses scripture, frequently, solemnly, and always in a tone that implies you should already know better. I called her the day I received the notice. She told me the community had concerns. I told her I wasn't in the HOA. She said, and I'm going to quote this exactly, because I wrote it down immediately after I hung up. Whether or not you've signed, your land falls under our sphere of influence. Sphere of influence. I hung up the phone. I went outside. I stacked firewood for about 45 minutes until I felt like a human being again. Then I went back inside, found an empty manila folder, wrote Vivian on the tab in capital letters, and dropped the violation notice inside. That folder was going to get very thick. 2 weeks after I ignored the violation notice, I walked out to check on the pond and found something that stopped me cold. orange survey flags, 8 of them driven into the ground in a diagonal line across the south corner of my property, cutting right through the edge of the tree line, heading toward the water. No letter, no phone call, no surveyor's name stamped on the plastic stakes. Just 8 little neon orange flags standing in my land like they belonged there. That particular shade of orange looks wrong against Montana pine green, like someone dropped a highlighter in a forest. I pulled one out. The plastic was warm from the afternoon sun and smelled faintly of diesel, the kind of smell that comes off a landscaping truck that runs all day. I stood there holding it for a moment. Then I pulled the other 7. I photographed every hole they left in the ground with my phone, timestamp on, GPS coordinates recorded. Then I drove to the county assessor's office and requested a certified copy of my parcel map, the official recorded document showing every boundary line of my 14 acres. Cost me $11 and about an hour of my afternoon, worth every penny. Here's your first practical insight, and I want you to actually remember this one. Your county assessor's office is one of the most powerful tools a property owner has, and most people never use it. A certified parcel map creates an official, time-stamped record of your boundaries that is extremely difficult to dispute in court. If someone is pushing on your property lines, get that document before anything else. Takeaway: a certified parcel map from your county assessor costs almost nothing and becomes your first line of legal defense in any boundary dispute. With that document in hand, I wrote Vivian a letter. Not an email, a letter, printed, signed, hand-delivered to her door. I cited Montana Code Section 70-16-111, the state's trespass statute, and informed her that the unauthorized placement of markers on private property constitutes trespass, that I had documented evidence of who placed them, and that any further actions on or toward my property would be recorded and considered for civil action. I was polite. I was precise. I did not threaten. I informed. Under Montana law, a property owner who can demonstrate willful trespass can seek actual damages, plus a penalty up to $1,000 per violation. 8 flags, 8 violations. You do that math. I thought the letter would slow her down. It did the opposite. Within 10 days, I received a new document, this one from the Flathead County Zoning Board. Vivian had filed a complaint claiming my wood stove was an illegal commercial-grade incinerator, operating without proper permits. A commercial-grade incinerator. I have a Jodel F602 wood stove that I bought at a hardware store in Kalispell for $840. It has a little cast iron handle and a glass window so you can watch the fire. It is, objectively, one of the most peaceful objects I own. The zoning board sent an inspector. He came out on a Tuesday morning, looked at the stove, looked at me, wrote something in his notebook, and closed the investigation 4 days later. No violation found. File closed. But here's what I noticed. The timing of that complaint was 3 days after I delivered my trespass letter to Vivian. She wasn't backing down. She was escalating. Every move I made, she pushed back harder, as if she genuinely believed that eventually I would get tired and give up. That told me something important about her. People who escalate under legal pressure usually do it because they've always won by sheer persistence before. They find someone who gets worn down, who decides the fight isn't worth it, who signs the paper or pays the fine just to make the noise stop. She had read me wrong. I already owned a trail camera, had for 2 years, because black bears are a real and enthusiastic presence in Flathead Valley, and I prefer to know when one is investigating my woodshed. The camera faced the access road. I checked the footage that evening out of mild curiosity. What I found wasn't bears. It was a golf cart, white, with a custom VP emblem on the hood. Parked on the logging road that borders my property. 2 people climbing out, walking onto my land, photographing my cabin. The footage was time-stamped. I made a copy. I put it in the folder. The folder was getting thicker. The zoning complaint dying on the vine didn't slow Vivian down for more than about 2 weeks. Then came the environmental report. It arrived certified mail, heavier envelope this time, cream-colored, with a logo in the upper left corner that said Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting, LLC. The report inside was 4 pages long, single-spaced, formatted to look official, and concluded that my spring-fed stock pond represented a stormwater runoff hazard to Ridgecrest common areas, requiring immediate remediation review. Attached was a cover letter signed by Vivian Pratt, requesting that I voluntarily suspend use of the pond, pending the outcome of the review. I read it twice. Then I did what I always do when something doesn't smell right, and this didn't smell right. It smelled like that burnt toner from the first letter, like something produced in a hurry by someone who needed it to look more official than it was. I typed Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting, LLC, into the Montana Secretary of State's business registry. The company had been formed 4 months ago. Its registered agent address was a house on Lakeview Court in Ridgecrest Pines. I pulled up the county property records for that address. It was Vivian Pratt's home. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then I called a water rights attorney in Missoula named Sandra Okafor. Not to file anything yet, just to understand what I was dealing with. I explained the situation. She asked me to email everything. 20 minutes after I did, she called me back laughing. Not the cruel kind of laughing. The kind that means you are not crazy, and this is exactly as absurd as you think it is. Here's what Sandra explained. Spring-fed stock ponds in Montana are regulated by the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, not neighborhood HOAs. More importantly, my deed includes an explicit water rights appurtenance, meaning the pond is legally tied to my land as a protected beneficial water use under state law. Vivian's consulting company had exactly zero authority to issue any kind of regulatory assessment about it. The report wasn't just wrong, it was potentially fraudulent. Sandra wrote a 2-page response letter that systematically dismantled every claim in the environmental report. It cost me $300. It was the best $300 I ever spent. But she flagged something else, something I hadn't thought to check. She asked whether Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting, LLC, held the proper state licensure required to issue official environmental assessments in Montana. I checked. It did not. A company with no licensed environmental professionals, formed 4 months prior, had issued a formal regulatory document to a private property owner in an attempt to restrict his use of his own land. Here's your second practical insight. When someone sends you an official-looking document from a company you don't recognize, look up that company's registration before you respond to a single word of it. Business registries are public, free to search, and take about 4 minutes. If the company is brand new, has no licensed professionals, and shares an address with the person harassing you, that document is not what it's pretending to be. Takeaway: always verify the legal standing of any company issuing you a regulatory or compliance document. A fraudulent assessment can become the foundation of a harassment claim against the person who sent it. I filed a complaint with the Montana Board of Professional Engineers and Land Surveyors regarding the unlicensed assessment. It wasn't dramatic. It was a PDF submitted through a government website on a Wednesday afternoon. I didn't tell Vivian, I just filed it and let it sit. Bureaucratic complaints are like seeds. You plant them, you water them occasionally, and then one day something grows that surprises everyone, especially the person who didn't know you were gardening. Meanwhile, I went back to the trail camera footage. The golf cart visit I'd caught earlier? I reviewed the timestamps more carefully and realized this wasn't an isolated incident. The camera had caught Vivian's landscaping crew on my property on 4 separate occasions over the past 2 months. Walking the fence line, photographing the cabin, once, apparently, testing the door handle. I had video of all of it. I added the dates and timestamps to a running log I'd started keeping in a spiral notebook. Then I drove into Kalispell and made printed copies of every frame where you could clearly see the golf cart emblem. The folder now needed a rubber band to stay closed. The water rights letter went unanswered. No response from Vivian. No acknowledgement. Just silence. The particular silence of someone who has decided to change tactics rather than retreat. About 3 weeks later, every resident of Ridgecrest Pines received a mass email from the HOA board. The subject line read, "Community Security Update. Concerns regarding adjacent property activity." The email didn't name me. It didn't have to. It described an adjacent parcel whose owner was allegedly operating an unlicensed short-term rental, bringing transient guests onto the property and creating security concerns for Ridgecrest families. I have never rented my cabin. Not for a night, not for a weekend, not for money, not for anything. I barely have reliable Wi-Fi up there. The idea of running a short-term rental from a property where the nearest coffee shop is 40 minutes away is genuinely funny to me. But the email generated fear, and that was the point. 3 Ridgecrest residents actually called the county sheriff's office to report it. The sheriff's department sent a deputy out to my property on a Thursday morning. He was a compact, unhurried man named Briggs, who had clearly done this before. He knocked on my door, accepted a cup of coffee, walked through the cabin, looked around the property for about 10 minutes, wrote in his report, "No evidence of commercial activity of any kind," and left. On his way out, he said, "Whoever filed this, they've got a lot of time on their hands." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. But that email bothered me in a specific way. It wasn't just the lie. It was the mechanism of the lie. Vivian had used the HOA's official email list, a community communication resource, to distribute what was essentially a smear campaign against a private citizen. That email list belonged to all 412 Ridgecrest residents. She had used it for a personal vendetta without any board vote, any member approval, or any factual basis. This is where I got practical and methodical about something most people don't know they can do. Under Montana's Nonprofit Corporation Act, which governs HOA governance in the state, members and affected parties can formally request access to board meeting minutes, voting records, and official correspondence. I hired a paralegal named Gwen in Missoula, cost me $150, to submit a formal document request to the Ridgecrest HOA on my behalf. I asked specifically for the board meeting minutes from the past 18 months, along with any recorded votes authorizing the environmental assessment, the mass email, and the complaint filings. What came back was illuminating in the worst possible way for Vivian. The documents arrived in a priority mailbox that smelled faintly of a storage unit, musty, slightly sour, the smell of paperwork that nobody expected to see daylight again. I read through them at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. By page 12, the legal pad was almost full. Neither the environmental assessment nor the mass email had been put to a board vote. No quorum. No recorded authorization. Vivian had taken both actions entirely on her own, in direct violation of Ridgecrest's own bylaws, which required a recorded majority vote for any official communication or enforcement action taken in the HOA's name. Here's your third practical insight. HOA board presidents are not kings. Every action they take in the HOA's name is supposed to be authorized by a vote, recorded in minutes, and available for review. If your HOA is weaponizing its official channels against you, request the meeting minutes. The paper trail almost always tells a different story than the one they're presenting. Takeaway: a formal records request under your state's Nonprofit Corporation Act costs almost nothing and frequently reveals unauthorized actions that expose board members to personal liability. I added this to the folder. The folder was now a box. And then, almost as an afterthought, on a Sunday evening when I was doing routine research, I typed Vivian Pratt's name into the county property records database. Just curiosity. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I found something. Her primary home in Ridgecrest had a recorded deed restriction from 1987 limiting the property to single-family residential use. And there was a permit pulled addition on the back of the house, approved under home office classification, that, based on the permit dimensions, was significantly larger than any home office I'd ever heard of. Separate entrance. Listed square footage suggesting a kitchenette. Under Montana law, that structure might qualify as an unauthorized accessory dwelling unit, the exact kind of violation she'd been accusing me of for months. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I didn't use it yet. Patience. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, from a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Warren Geddes, 71 years old, retired title officer, lifelong Flathead County resident who now volunteered at the local historical society. He'd heard about my situation through mutual friends, the kind of word of mouth that travels fast in rural Montana, where everyone eventually knows everyone's business whether they want to or not. Warren told me I should pull the original plat for Ridgecrest Pines, not the current recorded version. The original, filed in 1994 when the development was first platted. I asked him why. He said, because the current version has been referenced so many times that people have stopped reading the original, and the original says something very specific that nobody's been paying attention to. I drove to the county recorder's office the next morning. Warren was right. The 1994 Ridgecrest Pines plat showed the development boundary with absolute clarity. My parcel was outside it by 340 feet, which I already knew. But what I hadn't seen before was a small notation in the lower right corner of the document, referencing a recorded easement running across the northeastern corner of my property. The easement had been granted to Ridgecrest Pines in 1994 for, and this is the exact language, emergency vehicle access only. That was it. Emergency vehicles. That's the entire scope of the easement. Not HOA maintenance crews, not landscaping golf carts, not board presidents conducting informal inspections. Emergency vehicles only. Every single time Vivian's crew had driven onto my property, and my trail camera had documented 4 visits, they were operating outside the terms of the easement that gave them any access rights at all. That's not just trespass. Under Montana property law, misuse of an easement beyond its recorded scope is classified as easement abuse, and it entitles the property owner to seek termination of the easement entirely. If I wanted to, I could close that corner of my property forever. But Warren wasn't finished. He'd also pulled Ridgecrest's original 1994 HOA formation documents, the founding covenants that Vivian had been selectively citing for months. And buried in Article 9, Section 4, was a liability clause that the HOA's current board apparently hadn't read carefully, or hadn't expected anyone else to read carefully either. The clause stated that any attempt by the HOA to subject a non-member parcel to covenant enforcement, without that parcel's written consent, created direct financial liability for the HOA if the enforcement action caused documented harm to the property owner. $300 in attorney fees, $150 in paralegal fees, 1 documented rental inquiry I'd declined during the dispute. All of it suddenly had a legal home to live in. I sat in my truck in the county recorder's parking lot for about 10 minutes after Warren walked me through it. The engine was off. It was quiet except for the sound of a flag snapping in the wind somewhere above the building. I want to pause here because this is the part where most people pick up the phone and start swinging. File everything at once. Go loud. Make noise. Decker Halverson did not do that. I drove home. I made a list. I called Sandra Okafor, and I said 4 words that I think changed everything about how this ended. I want to be ready. Sandra Okafor had a whiteboard in her office in Missoula. By the time we finished our first full strategy meeting, it was covered. She agreed to take the case on a partial contingency basis, meaning her full fee came due only if we recovered damages. Once she saw the trail cam footage, the original plat, and the founding covenant liability clause, she said, and I'm quoting directly, "This isn't a difficult case. This is a well-documented case. Those are my favorite kind." We built a team, 4 people beyond Sandra and me. Warren Geddes agreed to provide a formal title expert statement if the case reached litigation. Ruth McAllister, a Flathead County commissioner, gravel-voiced and unhurried, the kind of elected official who has been in the job long enough to recognize manufactured bureaucratic drama on site, took an informal interest after I showed her the Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting LLC registration documents. She didn't make any promises. She just looked at the paperwork, looked at me and said, "I'm going to make a few calls." Then there was Felix Dunbar, 64 years old, retired state trooper, now ran a small property surveillance business out of a truck he kept immaculately clean. Felix came out to the cabin on a Saturday morning and spent 4 hours installing a proper exterior camera system. 4 weatherproof units covering every approach to the property. 2 cameras were mounted in plain sight, bolted to the porch posts at eye level. Obvious, visible, intentional. 2 were not. 1 tucked into the woodpile stack near the fence line. 1 set under the porch eave behind a support beam. All 4 captured video only. No audio. This matters legally, and I want to be clear about it. In Montana, and in most states, recording video on the exterior of your own property without audio does not require the consent of anyone being recorded. You're on your land. The camera is facing your land. Audio recording laws are considerably more complicated and vary significantly by state. Felix knew this cold, and he set every camera to video only specifically for that reason. Takeaway: Exterior video surveillance on your own property is legal in most states without consent, but always verify your state's audio recording laws before adding sound. That one detail can be the difference between evidence and a lawsuit. With the cameras in place, Sandra laid out the three-phase legal strategy. Phase 1, a formal cease and desist letter, sent certified mail with return receipt, covering trespass, easement abuse, and unauthorized use of HOA communications. This wasn't an attack. It was documentation, proof that Vivian had been formally warned, with a date stamp, before anything else happened. Phase 2, a complaint to the Montana Commissioner of Political Practices, arguing that Vivian's use of the HOA email list for a personal harassment campaign potentially exposed the HOA to organizational liability. This complaint, if accepted, would put a second government agency in the file, alongside the Board of Engineers complaint I'd already submitted. Phase 3, a civil lawsuit for trespass, easement abuse, and damages under the 1994 liability clause, with easement termination as the ultimate remedy on the table. Here's why that third piece mattered strategically. That easement corner on my property is the only practical route to the eastern walking trail that Ridgecrest residents use regularly. Without it, they'd have to walk an extra half-mile around the development perimeter. Vivian had been depending on my passive tolerance of the easement's misuse to keep that trail accessible. She'd never considered that the easement was terminable, or that I knew it. The cease and desist went out on a Wednesday. Certified mail, return receipt, delivered to Vivian's door on Friday morning. And then I did one more thing, a simple thing. I drove to the hardware store and bought 3 no trespassing signs, the standard county-approved format, white with red lettering, 8.5 by 11 inches, and mounted them at my property boundary at the legally required height and spacing. Why does this matter? Because in Montana, properly posted no trespassing signage changes the legal classification of future willful trespass. A person who enters posted land after receiving a cease and desist isn't just committing civil trespass, they're potentially committing criminal trespass, a significantly more serious matter. Takeaway: posting correct no trespassing signage before a known conflict can change the legal classification of future unauthorized entry from civil to criminal. Check your state's specific signage requirements, because the details matter. That evening, Felix's cameras blinked green in the dark at every corner of my property. I made a bowl of chili on the wood stove. The cabin smelled like cumin and wood smoke. I sat on the porch and watched the indicator lights. For the first time in months, I felt like the patient one. And in this particular situation, patience was the most dangerous thing I had. 3 days after Vivian received the cease and desist, she did not comply. Of course she didn't. What she did instead was call a reporter at a small regional newspaper in Kalispell. She gave an anonymous tip, at least she thought it was anonymous, claiming that a compound-style property near Ridgecrest was being operated by a survivalist who posed a potential fire hazard to surrounding properties. A survivalist. Because I have a wood stove and a woodshed. The reporter's name was Tom Birchfield. He drove out to my property on a Tuesday, spent about 20 minutes looking around, spent another 20 minutes talking to me on the porch, and then politely declined to write the story Vivian had been hoping for. What he said before he left was, "This isn't really the story here, is it?" I told him there was a bigger one if he was interested. He gave me his card. He said to call him when the time was right. I kept the card. Meanwhile, Ruth McAllister had been making those calls she mentioned. She pulled the full business registration for Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting, LLC, and discovered something I hadn't yet confirmed. The company's co-founder, listed alongside Vivian in the formation documents, was her adult son, Bradley Pratt, age 34, who manages a self-storage facility in Polson and holds no environmental credentials of any kind. No degree, no license, no certification, nothing. The company had been in existence for 4 months. It had issued exactly one document in that time, the fraudulent environmental assessment against my pond. Ruth referred the matter to the county attorney's office for a preliminary review of potential fraudulent business practices. This was not yet public. It was a referral, a file being opened in a government office somewhere, the kind of thing that sits quietly until someone needs it. Then Vivian called me directly. It was a Sunday morning. I was drinking coffee and watching a pair of white-tailed deer work the edge of the tree line near the pond. She opened with pleasantries, actually pleasantries, like we were acquaintances who'd had a minor disagreement, rather than people who had been in active legal conflict for 4 months. Then she got to the point. She would make everything go away, all of it, every complaint, every filing, if I agreed to sign a document acknowledging Ridgecrest's advisory authority over my parcel. Just a signature, just a formality, just a small, quiet surrender dressed up in bureaucratic language. I said, "Let me think about it." She sounded pleased when we hung up. What she didn't know was that I'd started keeping a digital voice recorder next to the phone about 6 weeks earlier. Montana is a single-party consent state for phone recordings, meaning I can legally record any call I'm a participant in without notifying the other party. The recording of that conversation, Vivian Pratt, HOA board president, explicitly offering to withdraw official complaints in exchange for a legal concession from a private property owner, was in Sandra Okafor's email inbox within the hour. Sandra called me back in 20 minutes. She used the word beautiful twice. What Vivian had just done, legally speaking, was offer something that could be characterized as using her official HOA authority as leverage in a personal negotiation, a potential abuse of organizational power that strengthened every claim in our civil complaint. She'd handed us a gift and wrapped it herself. Behind the scenes, Sandra had also been quietly making contact with 2 other property owners, both of them adjacent to Ridgecrest, neither of them HOA members, who had received similar advisory notices from Vivian's board in the past 2 years. Both of them had ignored the notices at the time, uncertain whether they had any recourse. Now, with the legal framework Sandra had built around my case, both of them wanted in. The civil complaint was no longer Decker Halverson versus Vivian Pratt over a boundary dispute. It was a documented pattern of conduct, 3 separate property owners, 18 months of unauthorized enforcement actions, a fraudulent consulting company, and an HOA president who had been operating well outside the boundaries of her own organization's bylaws. That changes the math considerably when you're sitting across from someone in a settlement conference. I went back to watching the deer. One of them looked up at me for a long moment, then went back to the grass. We understood each other. Vivian had been quiet for about 10 days after the Sunday phone call. Then she found the Ridgecrest Pines neighborhood Facebook group and decided that was her next battlefield. The post went up on a Thursday evening, 4 paragraphs long, carefully worded to avoid naming me directly, while making absolutely certain every one of the 412 members knew exactly who she was talking about. She described ongoing legal and safety concerns with a non-compliant adjacent property. She used the word "unfortunately" 4 times. She attached a photograph. The photograph was of my cabin, taken from the logging road, after the cease and desist had been delivered to her door. Comments came fast. Most were supportive, the kind of reflexive community solidarity response that happens when a trusted authority figure frames something as a shared threat. A few were skeptical, and then, about 40 minutes into the thread, a woman named Constance Adler posted a single line. "Has anyone actually spoken to the property owner?" Vivian deleted the comment within the hour, but Constance had already been seen by enough people that 3 of them messaged her privately. And Constance, it turned out, was not someone you could simply delete and move on from. She called me 2 days later. Constance Adler, 67 years old, retired judge from Missoula, 11-year Ridgecrest resident, and by her own description, the person at every HOA meeting who keeps asking where the financial disclosures are. She had been raising objections to Vivian's expanding board authority for 2 years. She had the meeting minutes to prove it, and she had the votes she'd lost to prove it too. We talked for 45 minutes. By the end of it, she wasn't just informed about my situation, she was engaged. The Ridgecrest HOA annual meeting was 6 weeks out. Constance said she intended to attend, bring a motion to audit all unilateral board actions from the past 18 months, and she was bringing people with her. I told her I appreciated it. She said, "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because this has been going on too long, and someone finally has the paperwork to back it up." I liked her immediately. Meanwhile, Vivian's activity did not slow. She filed a nuisance complaint with the county sheriff's office, claiming I was operating a commercial woodcutting business without a license, based, apparently, on the fact that I had a large stack of firewood visible from the road. The responding deputy was, by remarkable small-town coincidence, Deputy Briggs, the same man who'd visited months earlier, drank my coffee, and found no evidence of anything. He called me before he even drove out. He said, "I'm going to come by and officially close this one. Just wanted you to know it's coming." When he filed his report, he noted that this was the third separate complaint Vivian Pratt had filed with county agencies regarding the same property, all of which had been investigated and dismissed. In law enforcement, a pattern of unfounded complaints against the same individual has a name. It's called vexatious reporting, and it creates its own paper trail, one that points in the direction of the person filing, not the person being reported. Deputy Briggs didn't say that to me directly, but he didn't have to. Sandra, meanwhile, had contacted the local FBI field office, a quiet, preliminary conversation flagging the interstate commerce implications of a company issuing fraudulent regulatory documents to property owners. This was not an investigation yet. It was a flag, a note in a file, the kind of thing that sits in a drawer until someone opens the drawer. Vivian had no idea any of this was in motion. It was mid-October. The aspen groves on my property had gone full gold, that particular bright yellow that lasts about 10 days in Montana before the wind takes it. I walked the fence line in the evenings, checking my no trespassing signs, checking the camera housings, watching the light change on the pond. The air smelled of coming snow and dry leaves and something faintly like wood smoke drifting from the cabin behind me. I felt the specific calm of a man who has done everything correctly and is now simply waiting for the other person to make the last move. She was going to make it. I knew that. People like Vivian always do. The question was just when, and whether she'd bring someone with her. The Ridgecrest Pines HOA annual meeting was held on the second Saturday of November, in the community center near the lake, a cedar-sided building with folding chairs, fluorescent overhead lighting, and a 30-cup coffee urn that had been burning the same batch since approximately 2014. 83 residents showed up, highest attendance in 7 years. Constance Adler had personally contacted 12 of them. Word had gotten around that this meeting was going to be different. Vivian arrived in pressed charcoal linen, PowerPoint clicker in hand, a smile that said she was completely in control of the room. She opened the meeting at 7 o'clock exactly, thanked everyone for attending, and clicked to her first slide. A title card that read, "Protecting Our Community, Year in Review." I was not inside that building. I am not an HOA member and had no standing to attend. I didn't need to be there. Sandra Okafor was in the parking lot with a process server. Tom Birchfield, the reporter from the Kalispell paper, the one Vivian had tried to weaponize against me 4 months earlier, was in the back row of the community center with a notebook. His story hadn't run in September. It ran that morning. The headline was measured but clear. Flathead County Attorney reviews HOA-linked company for fraudulent practices. It named Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting LLC. It named Bradley Pratt. It did not yet name Vivian by name, but anyone in that room who read it before the meeting started knew exactly who was being discussed. Vivian was 3 slides into her presentation when the back door opened. A Flathead County code enforcement officer and a sheriff's deputy walked in. They were not there for drama. They were deliberate, quiet, professional. They moved down the side aisle. The room noticed. The room went silent in that particular way rooms go silent when something official and unexpected is happening. The officer approached Vivian at the front of the room and handed her a document packet. The civil complaint, filed that morning by Sandra Okafor on behalf of myself and 2 co-complainants. And a second document, formal notice that the Flathead County Attorney's Office had opened an inquiry into Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting, LLC, for potential fraudulent business practices. Vivian looked down at the papers, looked up at 83 people watching her, looked back down. The coffee urn gurgled in the kitchen. While this was happening inside the community center, and the timing here was not accidental, it was coordinated to the minute, Felix Dunbar's cameras activated an alert on my phone. Bradley Pratt had arrived at my property. He came in through the easement corner with a set of bolt cutters, the same tool his mother had apparently decided was the family's go-to instrument, and cut my new padlock off the gate I'd installed at the property boundary. Then he walked onto my land toward the fence line near the woodpile, apparently headed for a locked storage box the HOA had placed on my property months earlier without my knowledge or consent. He was on my land, in violation of a served cease and desist, with bolt cutters in his hand. 2 sheriff's deputies, who had been briefed by Sandra and positioned a quarter-mile down the logging road, drove up within 90 seconds of Felix's alert. They found Bradley Pratt standing on my property next to my cut gate, holding the bolt cutters, with 4 camera angles documenting every second of it. He was detained, cited for criminal trespass and misdemeanor vandalism. The storage box was photographed and inventoried by the deputies as potential evidence. Back at the community center, Constance Adler stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a speech. She simply moved, formally, with a clear second from 3 residents near the front, that the board vote immediately on retaining an independent attorney to review all board actions taken by Vivian Pratt without recorded authorization over the past 18 months. The vote was 51-12. Vivian was still holding the civil complaint papers. Tom Birchfield was writing in his notebook. The process server had already left. I got the call from Felix about 4 minutes after Bradley was detained. I was standing on my porch in the November cold, watching the aspens, bare now, just white branches against a gray sky. My phone buzzed. Felix said 2 words, "It's done." I went inside and put a log on the fire. Here's how the pieces came down. Bradley Pratt was cited for criminal trespass and misdemeanor vandalism for the destroyed padlock. He pled down to a fine and 40 hours of community service. The criminal filing didn't go away, though. It became part of the evidentiary record in the civil case, alongside the trail cam footage, the cease and desist records, and the documented pattern of HOA violations. Vivian resigned from the HOA board 12 days after the annual meeting. Not voted out, not fired. Quietly advised by her personal attorney that continued board involvement would only amplify her personal exposure in the civil suit. She submitted a 1-paragraph resignation letter. The board accepted it the same day. The civil case did not go to trial. 4 months after Sandra filed the complaint, Vivian's homeowner's insurance carrier, covering her to her policy limit, which was less than Sandra had estimated in potential damages, authorized a settlement. The number was $47,000. That covered my documented legal fees, out-of-pocket costs, the 2 co-complainants' documented losses, and a negotiated payment in lieu of full easement termination. In exchange, Vivian and the Ridgecrest HOA agreed to formally restrict the easement to its original emergency vehicle-only language, install a locked gate, accessible only to county emergency services, and issue a written acknowledgement that my property had never been subject to HOA jurisdiction. The walking trail that Ridgecrest residents had been using through my property corner, the one Vivian had been depending on my passive tolerance to keep open, was closed to general use. I didn't have to do that. It was my choice. But if you spend months weaponizing a legal document against someone, you don't get to be surprised when they read it more carefully than you did. The Ridgecrest Environmental Consulting LLC matter ended with Bradley Pratt pleading guilty to 1 count of issuing a fraudulent regulatory document. The fine was modest. The record is permanent. The company was dissolved. And here's the thing about Vivian's unauthorized addition on her home. The one that looked a lot like an accessory dwelling unit. The same violation she'd been falsely accusing me of for months. I never filed a complaint about it. I never used it as leverage. I mentioned it once to Sandra, who smiled and said, "Keep it in your back pocket." We never needed it. I took $8,000 of the settlement and donated it to the Flathead County 4-H Land Stewardship Program, a youth agricultural education initiative that teaches high school students about water rights, property law, and sustainable land management. Kids learning to read a deed, understanding what a parcel map means, knowing what questions to ask before someone plants flags in their land. I also worked with the Flathead Land Trust to place a conservation easement over the pond and the surrounding riparian area, permanently protecting it from development. The trust provides a modest annual tax benefit in return. My cabin, my pond, my 14 acres, legally protected, financially stabilized, and on the historical record as land worth preserving. Warren Geddes came to dinner that fall. So did Constance Adler. I made venison stew on the wood stove. The Yotul F602, operating in full compliance with all applicable regulations, and we ate at the table I'd built from timber off the property. The wood smoke smell drifted out over the bare aspen trees. Everything was exactly the way I'd imagined it when I was 35 years old, and saving money and promising myself that one day I'd have a place like this. My daughter drove up from Bozeman the following weekend. She hadn't visited in 2 years. She stood at the pond edge in the November cold and looked at the water and the tree line and said, "This place is exactly what you always described." That sentence ended the whole thing for me. Not the settlement, not the guilty plea, not the resignation letter. That sentence.
11 minutes. That's all the time Diane spent in the utility room at 11:17 p.m., convinced she was erasing every trace of what she had done. I didn't know Marcus had already built a system that logged every second of it. That's the part that stays with me about this story. She wasn't caught because Marcus was smarter. She was caught because she couldn't stop. 7 years of unchecked power, and when the walls started closing in, she walked straight into the one room she should have stayed out of. And that's what petty authority always does. It doesn't know when to stop. It mistakes silence for surrender. It reads patience as weakness. Marcus never raised his voice, never sent a hostile email, never showed his hand early. He just documented, filed the right complaints with the right agencies, and let the laws that already existed do exactly what they were written to do. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act didn't care that Diane was an HOA president. The Ohio Secretary of State didn't care that she had held that seat for 7 years. The law is patient, too. It just needs someone who knows how to use it.